Good morning, everybody. I'm Chris Jones. I'm with the University of Arizona, Gila County Cooperative Extension, and you're with Rich Johnson and me today to talk about winter gardening. This is part of the series called Garden and Country Extension Webinars, and very happy to have you with us today. Just a little bit about these webinars. They are a weekly Zoom webinar, 60 minutes or less, Thursdays at 11 o'clock in Arizona. If you have questions for Rich, and as long as he's willing to stick around, we'll go over that 60-minute time, but I'll go ahead and stop the recording just so that we can get these up and consumable for people to watch. It's an hour program as long as it is. These webinars feature a variety of horticultural and natural resource topics relevant to the environmental conditions and residential concerns of Gila County and anywhere else in the world that you are interested in what we're talking about. The recording of this will be posted at extension.arizona.edu/Gila. We also have a playlist at the University of Arizona on YouTube. If you would go to the chat box, I just put that in there. Feel free to bookmark that and keep it. And the University of Arizona is an equal opportunity affirmative action institution. And so with that, I'm going to open up our affirmative action poll. And if you just share a little information about yourself, this is set to be anonymous. And this is information we need to report back about our programs. So please take a moment there, and I'll leave that up for a few minutes while we get through this, and then take it down when Rich gets started. Here's our agenda for today. Thank you for everybody who came in a little bit early for the log in and lag time. Rich and I had a little discussion, so you got to listen in on us. Welcome. My name is Chris Jones. I'm your moderator. And here in just a moment, Rich Johnson is going to talk about how to start your winter garden. He has a PowerPoint show or slideshow for us, about a half an hour. We'll open up that for question and answer discussion with Rich when we finish that. Please put your questions in the Q&A or the chat box, and I'll relay those to Richard. And we'll wrap up here by noon. Here is our presenter, Rich Johnson. He's an Arizona organic gardener and a University of Arizona, Gila County Master Gardener. And he wears a wide brim hat like we all should in the sun. And so with that, Rich, welcome. How are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty well. Glad to be with you.
Great. Well, we've got a really good turnout for today's presentation. You can take over the screen, and it's all yours now.
Okay. Okay. Welcome everybody, and thank you, Chris, for. Do you have that poll? Is that in process? I mean, on your screen now?
I'm going to end it right now here. So is that out of the way?
No, something else. The poll's still there, and
oh, just click it. Turn it off if it's in front of you. Just hit the Xbox or whatever.
Well, I don't have a cursor here while I'm screen sharing.
Then turn it off and get it out of the way.
Well, let's see.
Do what it takes. Yeah, it's just still up on Rich's here. We'll get it in a second.
Okay, there we go. I think we got it now.
Good. Thanks, Kathleen.
Okay, there we are. Okay. Well, thank you, Chris, for inviting me to talk with your group again. I'm always happy to do this, and it's kind of fun to talk about some of this gardening stuff with fellow gardeners. Now, I'm assuming for this garden presentation, this winter gardening presentation, that for the most part, all of you have established gardens already. But if you don't, I want to say just a couple of things. If you're going to be putting in a new garden, or if you're going to be using containers for your winter garden, you want to be sure that you put it in a place where there's going to be plenty of sunshine. We're talking at least 6 hours a day of sunshine. More is actually better. And if you have some southerly obstructions, that you're concerned about, like for example, a wall or a tree that might cast a shadow onto your stuff, but you're not sure whether it will or it won't, here's a good way to find out. If you estimate the height of the obstruction and multiply that height by 1.4, that's the length of the shadow that obstruction will cast on December 21st at noon. That's the shortest day of the year. So you can kind of use that as a measuring tool to figure out whether you're going to have sunshine problems or not. And if all you're doing is you're putting your garden to bed to sleep for the winter, all you really need to do with that is to add some compost and amendments if you need them, and cover the whole thing with mulch and water as needed to get through the winter. What will happen there is all the microbes will start working on all that stuff that you added and work on the soil all during the winter, but it's going to do it very slowly. But then winter is pretty long and it'll take a while for it to happen. But come summer, that garden soil will be in really good shape and ready to start your spring garden. Now, if you're planning to start things like broccoli or cauliflower from seed, then you're going to want to plant 6 to 8 weeks ahead of any dates that I give you in here, whether you plant indoors or outdoors or whatever. Just be sure that you give it enough lead time so that you have a decent plant at the dates that I give you. So talking about winter and fallish, fall is an absolutely great time to plant a lot of things like trees and perennials and bulbs and vegetables, even here in Payson, Arizona. Now I'm going to talk about some of the ABCs of winter gardening, but I'm also going to focus on a few particular crops to help you get the most out of them. And that'll happen toward the end. So ask yourself this one question: why do you want to grow a winter garden in the first place? Well, wouldn't it sure be nice to be able to get a whole bunch more food from that garden that you laboriously dug for your summer tomatoes? Of course it would. So the very best reason that you would want to grow a winter garden is that it is the absolute best time to grow some crops, things like broccoli and cauliflower. And for example, you have your root crops, things like carrots and radishes and beets. And then there are the onions and garlic. Onions need some time to dry to store them, so this is a good way to do it. Garlic is kind of the same situation. And of course, all your leafy crops like your lettuces and spinach and chard and kale. Here's some chard I grew in a pot in Tucson. This won't work quite as easily in this colder climate, but it can be done. I did do it last winter. It didn't do as well as what you're seeing here, but you can grow chard here in the wintertime with big leaves like this. And another thing that you probably aren't going to end up doing, and I'm only going to mention a time or two, is wheat. Winter wheat can be grown here very well. Here's me when my let's talk this spring. This was springtime when the wheat was still green here. And then a couple weeks or months later, along about the 1st of July, this is what it looks like when it's about ready to harvest. This is what they refer to in that song as the amber waves of grain. That's what it looks like when the wind blows across it. And the timing is also very important in the summertime, extremely important when you're down in the valley or in the Tonto Basin area. But in the wintertime, timing is quite a bit more flexible. So you have a little more leeway there. So that's a really good thing. The absolute worst thing about winter gardening, though, is having to remove some of your productive summer crops in order to make room for the winter stuff. It's kind of a tough decision. It's the gardener's dilemma, kind of a tough thing to do, but in order to get the most out of your winter garden, you're going to have to do at least some of that. So you're also going to need to ask yourself, what do you want to grow? This is a true story that I want to share with you about that. I had a friend a couple of years ago, and I asked him, I says, what are you growing this summer? He said, I'm growing some okra. Well, how's it doing? Oh, it's doing really well. It's up 4 feet tall already. Well, how does it taste? Well, I don't know. I hate okra. But believe it or not, that was a story that actually happened. And so just to kind of narrow things down for you a little bit, as a general rule, if you're eating the leaves or the roots, it's going to be a winter crop. So we're talking things like the lettuce and the chard and the kale and the carrots and the beets, stuff like that. If you're eating the fruit, then it's a summer crop. So things like tomatoes and zucchini. So it's just a good rule of thumb to do things. So obviously with this rule of thumb, you can't expect to grow tomatoes in the winter. That's just not going to happen out in the open anyway. Okay, so you need to plant at the right time. Now, again, as I mentioned, summer gardening in Arizona is something that's really, the timing of it is really critical when you're down in the lower elevations. I mean, things have to be timed quite well or you're not going to do well. But fortunately, winter gardening, as I said earlier, is a whole lot more forgiving than at any other time of the year. So you have some room to play there. All right, so now it's time to actually kind of dig in a little bit. So let's talk a little bit about soil preparation. In the real estate world, there's a saying that the three most important things are location, location, location. Well, in the gardening world, it's soil, soil, soil. Can't emphasize that enough. I take the organic approach like Chris teaches in his Master Gardener class. The soil food web is an extremely diverse, interconnected environment. Its real claim to fame, though, is the way it feeds the plants through its roots. Bacteria and fungi start decomposing the organic matter in the soil, and then the little protozoa, the little single-celled critters like amoebas and parameciums, they come along and they eat the bacteria and the fungi. And then these protozoa, they excrete inorganic substances that are what the plants really need. But what do these bacteria and fungi get out of the deal? They're not there just for the fun of it. Well, believe it or not, the roots actually secrete sugary substances that the bacteria and fungi need and eat. And as I said, this is an extremely interconnected world. So you contrast that with the method with chemical fertilizers that some gardeners use. Here's what happens when you use chemicals. You pour the chemicals on the ground and they percolate on down through the soil to the roots of the plants, and the roots absorb these chemicals and they say, thank you very much. These chemicals are very helpful to the plants in their limited way. Now, I say limited because the chemicals have lots of NPK. That's the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Those are the three numbers that you'll see on any fertilizer bag. But unfortunately, that's all those chemical fertilizers have, just that NPK. But what happens next with those chemicals? The unused chemicals, the parts that the plants don't absorb, they keep on percolating down through the soil all the way to the water table where they pollute your wells. Not a good thing. When you add compost, you are giving the soil much more than just the basic NPK. You're adding all the secondary and trace minerals that are lacking in the chemicals. And you're feeding the soil food web that produces all the things that the plant needs, and it does it right where the plant needs it, right in the roots. And it stays there, right in that root area. It just keeps on going. It's a continuous factory, if you will, of good food for your plants. So I came up with a saying: your job as a gardener and as a composter is to create the absolute best possible environment for the microbes. They are what make your garden happen. If you didn't have the microbes, you would not have much of a garden at all. So one of the best pieces of advice I'm going to give you today is start your compost pile now, so you'll have compost the next time you need it. While we're on the subject of compost, I add compost to my beds at every season. And compost is mostly about organic matter, but it's also about all the microbes that it adds to the soil. So again, as I say, I add it every season, and because it helps replace the nutrients that were lost during the previous season's growth. Amendments are another thing you need to think about. It's a good idea to do a home soil test to determine what your NPK and pH levels are. And that way you'll have some idea on where you stand, because you can overdo it. And the folks in the Payson Community Garden found out about that fairly recently when some soil tests were done and they were trying to figure out why some things were not working as well as they should have. They actually had too much good stuff in the soil. pH adjustment is another thing to think about. Again, a home soil test will tell you about that. Our Western soils tend to be very alkaline, and so soil sulfur can be added to compensate for that. And all the amendments and soil sulfur and things like that can be done with organic products, so you don't have to be using the chemicals. And while we're on the subject of soil, I always like to throw in this little tidbit right here. The ideal soil is 45% minerals, 5% organic matter, 25% water, and 25% air. Now, Payson's soil has much less than 5% organic matter, and chances are that's a similar situation for you wherever you are in most of the Southwest. So it's obvious you're going to have to do some amending of the soil. Okay, so now that we've talked about the soil, let's actually start planting and get a little more information about that. We're going to talk about some specific dates and specific crops. You want to be putting in your broccoli and cauliflower starts somewhere around the 1st of September. Now, again, this is kind of a tough decision to make because around the 1st of September, your summer crops are probably still doing pretty well unless you're down in the lower elevations, at which point they're probably cooked and just about no good at all. So this is one of those crops that does really well, the broccoli and cauliflower that is, but do really well when they're started warm and finished cold. And that means that you planted it when the weather was warm and the soil was warm, and you're going to harvest it when everything is cooled off quite a lot. If you plant in around that September 1st time frame, you will be harvesting broccoli and cauliflower around the Thanksgiving time. That's when you can start, and it will go right into December very nicely. So it's a very, very good, easy timing thing to use. Now, if you want to do succession planting with broccoli or cauliflower, and you were to plant in, let's say, mid to late October, you would plant it that way, and you'd end up wondering, why aren't my plants doing so well? Why are they so slow? Well, everything slows down tremendously in the wintertime. You have to be aware of that. Things are going to slow down a whole bunch in the wintertime. And you're probably not then going to end up harvesting stuff until springtime. We're talking, maybe February and definitely into March. So it's just kind of a timing, an important timing thing. And this hopefully tells you why you really do need to pull out some of your summer crops to get your winter crops in early if you want to get a good early harvest in the colder weather. Okay, your root crops can go in and be planted with a similar timing to what I just gave you, and that'll give you similar results. Root crops tend to take a little bit longer, so it may be a little bit later, but it gives you roughly a good idea. Again, if you plant later, they're going to take a whole lot longer. And by the way, daikon radishes, they are a really good crop to grow if you have a compacted soil and you want to break it up and make it a little more usable for summertime. So you can use that. They have a very large root, and they go right down and they penetrate tough soils, unlike carrots, which tend not to do that quite as well. And the real great thing about these daikon radishes is not only can you eat that root, but you can also eat all the leaves and the stems. They're all edible, and they all have a slight peppery taste, which is kind of nice. It has a bit of a pretty good flavor to it. Now, for your leafy crops, like your lettuces and spinaches, you can plant those by seed anytime in that September, October timeframe, and they'll grow fairly quickly. They produce all winter long, and they're a good crop to grow just because they're easy. Kale and chard can be done by seed or from starts. You can usually find those in the nursery as starts, but you can do them from seeds. And again, they will produce all winter long. Once the warmer weather comes, though, I have to tell you that most of these leafy crops, they're going to do what's called bolt. They're going to bolt. And that means they're going to throw up a woody stem up the center of all that leafy stuff that's growing up there. And they're going to produce much smaller leaves that are much more bitter than what you've been accustomed to. But of course, by the time all that happens, which is when the warm weather's coming along, you've eaten so much of this stuff, you've had enough, and you're willing to just let it go, and oh well, no problem. Chard is one of those semi-exceptions to the rule, though. You can plant chard, as I said, right here in the fall, and it'll produce all winter. But you can also replant chard in the spring, let's say in that Marchish kind of time frame, and it'll produce long into the summer before it bolts. And if you wanted to do some more succession planting with that, you could plant partway through the summer and get another crop going to take over when this your second planting fizzled out on you because of the heat. It does quite well. Kale will do similar things. Okay, onions and garlic are kind of a different animal in some respects. You can plant them in October and harvest them in that June, July kind of time frame. And I'll tell you, that is a long, long time to be in the ground. So you need to think about that when you're planning, because you're not going to be able to put in your early summer crops in that May sort of time frame in that bed, because it's taken up by your onions and garlic. So got to plan for that. Onions are much better planted in the March time frame, even when the ground still freezes every time it frosts. And with those, you're going to end up harvesting that in July and August. Notice how the harvest time there, when you plant in March, is only a little bit later than the harvest time if you planted back in October. So it's actually better to do in that spring time frame, that March kind of time frame. Onions and garlic can be stored fairly well when you dry them properly. But a little tip for you here, the sweeter onions have a much shorter shelf life. Garlic will keep for many months, however. Another thing about onions, you want to choose a short day or an intermediate day onion versus a long day onion. So this is what that means. A short day onion, for example, is one that is grown in a part of the country that gets fewer daylight hours than a more northerly area. When the seasons change and we start warming up, we're going to get less sunshine than Washington State or Alaska, things like that. So don't make the mistake of buying a long day onion. It's not going to produce very well for you. Again, I'm going to mention wheat again. Wheat is another one of those things that you're probably not going to grow, but if you do, it's going to be in the ground a really long time. Winter wheat goes in around October 1st or anywhere in October, and you're not going to harvest it until the first week of July. That's in the ground a long time. But one of the benefits to having wheat, growing wheat anyway, is that wheat is absolutely impervious to the winter. It will handle whatever cold gets thrown at it. You don't have to do any protection for the cold whatsoever. Okay, so now once you've got some stuff planted, you're going to want to do some mulching. And mulch is a really good thing. I'm a big believer in mulch. It does a whole bunch of really great things for you. Number one, especially in the summertime, it reduces evaporation. It also works in the winter, though. Now, it also gives a super place for insects and microbes to live and breed and eat and break down the mulch that you put on there. And that broken down mulch is going to turn into a fertilizer for your soil. So it really works out to be super beneficial there in multiple ways. Another real good thing about mulch is that it cools the roots in the summertime, and it keeps the soil warm in the wintertime. And it suppresses weeds. That's a real big thing for a lot of people. I know people who say they will not garden because they don't like to weed. This is a real big plus for the whole thing. Now you're going to want to add mulch when your seedlings are up around, say, 3 or 4 inches tall. I usually like to shoot for about 4 inches or more. And you can put the mulch in around all those plants like that. Now, if you're putting in starts, you can actually put the mulch on first and then spread the mulch out and plant your starts then, and then sort of push the mulch back around the plant a little bit. And you might find that to be easier than getting the plants to the state that I'm in right here in this picture, and then trying to work all the mulch around the plants. It's just a little bit tedious. And I use shredded leaves for my mulch. So there's basically that same bed that's been mulched. I also added some mulch to my walking paths, but you can see how much mulch I put on there. There's only a little bit of the leaves sticking out. So there was the before picture again, and here's the after picture. So I put a lot of mulch on, and I use, as I said, shredded leaves are my main thing because that's what I have access to. So now that you have all that done, you've got all your planting done and things are going, you need to just sort of pay attention to the tending of your market. Of your garden. It kind of feels like you're on autopilot, but you're not quite in that mode because there are still things that need to be done. Tending your garden is going to require you to pay attention to watering. Water is the most important thing that you're going to do to your garden once the garden is planted. You want to be regular and even about it. And that means now in a winter garden, the timing of all that is much more forgiving than in the summertime. In the summer, if you miss a watering day or two, your plants are going to scream. But in the wintertime, you have a lot more leeway there. So it's a little easier in that way. So you can choose to do an automated system, which is very doable. You can use all the drippers and the timers and all that stuff, but you do still have to monitor it because some of that stuff will end up plugging up and causing you trouble. And you don't want your crops to die just because something broke down that was very simple. You can use the manual method, which means you're either using a watering can or a hose or something like that. And one of the real benefits to that is that you get to keep a much closer eye on your garden. You're going to be able to spot things that happen there before you would if you were using an automated system. And another little tip there is use rainwater every chance you get. Rainwater is far superior to the city water or well water. It's just really nice stuff for your crops. Another little thing that you have to deal with here, you may have to deal with, is fertilizer. Now, fertilizers can be put on to the top of your soil and watered in. You've all probably done that one way or the other. But there's another thing that you can do for fertilizing, another way of doing it. It's called side dressing. So what you do here is you dig a little trench alongside of your crops. You want to be far enough away so that you're not disturbing the roots of the plants that are there. Dig a little trench. And you can see here in this picture, starting at the bottom, that I have a coffee filter with some coffee grounds inside of it. And then there are some celery pieces there, and there's some orange peels, and there's a banana peel in there. You can pretty much throw just about anything in there. Then you bury it over and just let the microbes do their job. This is the most efficient way of composting that I know of. Everything that breaks down in this thing is going to stay right there in the soil, or almost all of it will. And that contrasts with regular batch composting, where you're going to lose a lot of nitrogen to the air. That just is part of the process. It happens every time. Another thing you're going to have to deal with is thinning. When you're planting root crops like carrots, you're almost always going to be doing that from seed. And you just can't really control the seed placement very well. So you're going to end up thinning a lot. So a good little tip here is that you want to cut away the unwanted plants right at the base using a pair of scissors, as opposed to pulling them up with your fingers. And the benefit to this is that you're not disturbing the roots of the plants that are right next to the ones that you're pulling out. And you can actually use this thinning process to your advantage, though. Here's an interesting little tip here. You can get an early harvest on your onions, for example, by planting twice as many onion sets as you want to end up with in the end of when it's harvest time. Now, you know what plant starts are. They're little plants. Well, when you're talking about onions, the little onions are called sets, onion sets. Here are a couple of bundles of onion sets. And so, like I said, if the recommendation is that you plant them every 6 inches apart, for example, you can plant them every 3 or 4 inches apart. And then as they start to grow, you can come along and harvest every other one. And that way you can be adding some of your stuff, the crops that you're trying to grow, you can add that to your salads and your stir fries and wherever else you would use a green onion. Now, you're not going to end up with big bulbs until right at the very end of the whole thing, but it gives you a good way to actually start some harvesting along the way, which makes it feel a little better when you're getting something out of your garden while you're waiting those 4 or 5, 6 months for those things to ripen up thoroughly. Now, weeding, of course, that weeding turns out to be the bane of a lot of gardeners. But as I said, if you do a lot of mulching, you're not going to have a huge problem with that. My beds tend to be very low on weeds. My walking paths are absolutely swamped with weeds right now, of course, and especially with this monsoon season that we've had. But my garden beds have very few weeds in them. Another thing you want to pay attention to, of course, is You want to watch out for diseases and bugs. Learn which bugs not to kill. So for example, ladybugs and praying mantids are good bugs to have. Once you learn about a problem bug's life cycle, you can actually take steps to avoid that problem. So that can be very helpful there. If you find diseased plants, you want to remove them from your garden entirely and put them in the trash, not in your compost. You want to get that stuff entirely out of your yard, away from anything that might be in or near your garden. And of course, if we're talking winter gardening, there's going to have to be some protection against the cold. That's just an inevitability. Winter crops are very cold hardy, but they are not cold proof. So you're going to have to use things like frost cloth to take care of it. Now, if you're expecting a light frost, like something maybe down to 28 degrees or so, most of the plants will usually tolerate that. They're going to slow down and you'll notice that they're not doing quite as quickly when they're recovering from that night, but they'll survive it quite well. Now, if you're going to have a colder night, if that's what's forecast, you're going to want to use some frost cloth. And it's best to use something to hold the frost cloth up off the plants if you can. And hoops work really well for this. And so that's one way of doing it. And it works out pretty well. If you're lucky enough to have a greenhouse, that's not the answer. Because inside your greenhouse, assuming it's a freestanding greenhouse, not one that's leaning up against your house, the temperature inside the greenhouse in the morning is going to be essentially the same as the temperature outside. So unless you're willing to heat the greenhouse, you're still going to have to do some covering of whatever it is you're growing in there. And again, frost cloth comes into play here. And I just want to show this picture. This is not frost cloth. This is what's called row cover. This is what you use in the summertime you might use it to extend the season a little bit, or you might use it to keep the sun, filter some of the sun off the crops. If you can see through it like this, it's row cover. Frost cloth you cannot see through it. It's a much heavier fabric. And so that's just a good way to be able to tell the difference. Another thing you're going to want to do with a winter garden, just like for your summer garden, is you're going to want to keep a garden log. And you want to do that every season. You don't want to end up making the mistakes that you made this year next year. You want to get that taken care of. And you want to be able to refer back to what you did, when and where, what you were growing, when and where. It really helps to have that info. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the actual harvesting. Some crops do really well if you pick them early and pick them often. So we're talking the leafy things like the chards and the lettuces and the kales, stuff like that. And of course, some things are a one-time deal, like onions. You pick it once and that's it, party's over. I'm going to throw in two more terms here that mostly apply to summer crops, but if you ever come across it on something that is a winter thing, you'll at least know what it means. A determinate variety of a particular crop means that it ripens all at once and that's it. It doesn't produce any more. There are indeterminate varieties, and those are the ones that you're probably most familiar with, particularly with tomatoes, where they produce throughout the whole season. That may be what you want, probably is what you want. So just be a little careful if you think you have the perfect thing to grow, but it turns out it's a determinate variety, and that's not what you want, at least you'll know what you need to make another choice. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about broccoli in particular. Broccoli is one of my favorite vegetables to talk about and to grow. Broccoli is one of those things that gives in many ways. And so I'm going to talk about what I refer to as the triple whammy of broccoli. So the first benefit to it is that it produces nice big main stalks. The main head comes up. This was my last winter's broccoli garden here, my raised bed. I grow a lot of broccoli, I eat a lot of it, and I freeze a lot of it. Freezes very well, keeps very well, and you can use it after that. Broccoli is one of those superfoods that's always mentioned in the health food diet lists and things like that. So the first thing is the real benefit, as I said, is getting this main head. That's the first benefit of broccoli. Number two, you're gonna be able to get what's known as side shoots, that big hole kind of thing in the middle there is where the main head was, and it was harvested. And then you'll notice all these little broccoli heads around the main shoot there, the main stem. And those are called side shoots. Those grow out from below where the main head was. And you can harvest those all the way down to the main stem if you want. And they're very tender and they're very tasty. They're much better than the main head. And you can even actually buy just those in the store from time to time. But if you're smart about it now and you want to get the most out of your broccoli plant, what you do is you look in this picture on the left side there, up in the left corner, that's where the main head was harvested. And then you'll see another couple of spots where some side shoots were harvested. And notice they were not harvested all the way down to the main stem. I harvested those up higher where I noticed that there were some side shoots coming out of the side shoot. So this is where you're getting an extra round of side shoots. And you can let those grow. And here you can see in this picture, the bottom is where the main head was. And the little red box in the center area, that's where the first side shoot was. And then the bigger red box above that is where our second side shoot was. And I've actually got third and fourths of this. So on a good year, you can really get a lot of broccoli out of your stuff. So that's the second benefit. Number one was the main head. Now you're getting side shoots. Now the third thing that you get out of the deal, once you're getting at the end of the season, by that time, and you've had second and third side shoots, you are definitely sick of broccoli. You're tired of eating it. You're tired of freezing it. You've had it with it. So just let it go if you have the time for it. If you don't need that bed for something else, let it grow. All those little balls that are in the seed head, each one of those little balls will turn into a flower. And here you can see the start of that little flower. And there's the process a little further along. And the flowers are starting to fall off. And eventually those flowers are going to produce a little seed pod. This is when it's very, very small. And that seed pod will eventually get bigger and it'll dry out. And so you can see the brown ones there are the ones that are drying out. The green ones just haven't gotten that far along yet. And they'll eventually dry out to the point where they are literally crisp. I mean, you touch them, you squeeze them, and they're going to just crunch and start to fall apart. And that's when you're going to break the seed pod in half, and you're going to harvest anywhere from 10 to 20 seeds out of that seed pod. Now, seeds obviously can be used to grow next year's broccoli, so that's one good use for it, of the seeds. But the real benefit, and this is the third one of the triple whammy that I talk about, the real benefit to it is that it makes excellent sprouts. Many of you may have tried seed sprouts before, but the best ones I've ever tasted are these broccoli sprouts. And if you've done any research about sprouts, you learn that sprouts are much more nutritious than the adult plant. So the main head of a broccoli plant is much less nutritious than the sprouts you're going to get from these little seeds. So it gives you another way to eat your broccoli, if you will, during the off season when you're not growing any broccoli. So that's the triple whammy. Now I'm going to add one extra thing to that, and that is that the leaves of broccoli are actually edible. They're a bit on the bitter side, but if you cook them into a stir fry or something, they actually work out very well. Now I'll mention beets. Beets is another one of those superfoods. You hear about that all the time. Now, if you plant in early August, and you can start eating the greens by sometime in mid-September, and you will eat the roots, the main part of the thing that you're looking for with a beet, sometime in early to late October. Now you can plant beets in early October. You can delay the planting, but again, everything is going to slow down, and you're not actually going to be eating stuff until that March-April timeframe. And the roots will probably end up being pretty small. They're not going to produce as well. And so there's one of the hazards of that later planting. You can plant beets in early March. And then if you do that, then everything happens quicker because things are warming up. You can start eating in June and July, but I will warn you that the leaves are going to likely be very buggy. The cabbage looper will probably get on there and start eating lots of holes into your leaves. So that was a little bit of a problem there. Beets need to be thinned when they're planted, even if you have planted the alleged seed in the planting spacing that they tell you, because each seed is actually many seeds in one. So there's no question that you're going to end up having to do some thinning. So just be prepared for that. Okay, so some recommendations for easy to grow things for people who are doing their first winter garden. Some of the easiest stuff to do is Swiss chard. Beets work pretty well if you're early enough. Lettuce and spinach. Most of these things produce all winter long if you get a good start on them. They're really good to eat, and they're fun, good crops. Pick the leafy ones you want to pick often to keep them going. So in conclusion, basically just don't be afraid of winter gardening. In general, there are far fewer bugs and fewer diseases to be concerned with. And many crops do very well in the cold weather, even here in Payson, Arizona. Well, that's all I have to say about that.
Well, thank you very much, Rich.
You're
I
welcome.
enjoyed that and learned a lot, and I'm sure, like everybody else, inspired and motivated to do more. We're getting some comments here, including applause. So at this time, let's go ahead and open it up for some Q&A with Rich. You've got the expert with you. Let's not miss our opportunity. And so I'm looking at the chat box here, and Barry asked, what is a USDA zone for Payson? And while you were speaking, I looked that up. I put it in there. You're 7A in town and 8A outside of town. So you're around an 8A where you are. And I included the plant hardiness USDA.gov link there if people want to check where they're at. And Kathleen mentions that she does compost in place. She wants to establish or move her strawberry bed. I know you're good at this, Rich. How much time must I allow for decomposition before putting in the strawberry crowns?
So you're trying to redo the beds? Is that what I'm understanding?
I think she's moving them into another spot. So she's mulched it.
Oh.
And she wants to make sure that it's not too hot, I think, for the strawberries. Crown.
I see. Okay. Yeah, assuming you haven't mulched or added too much compost too early, that is to say, when it's still heating up and going through that whole process, that you can mix it with your soil that you have in your new bed, and you can plant probably essentially right away. I've done this transferring from one bed to another thing a few times now, including this season, and it takes very well. If you get all that stuff planted in the fall, for example, you get all your new starts into your new bed in the fall. That next spring, it'll have struggled through the winter because they're new plants and it was cold and you didn't cover it at all, but it'll make it through until spring, and then things warm up and they start to grow. And by the end of the season, actually even by the middle of the season, that entire new bed of yours will be full. I mean, absolutely full, wall to wall with plants. So it works out very well.
They're pretty forgiving or aggressive. I mean, strawberries like to root. I mean, as long as you give them some water, they're going to grow.
Yes, they are. They do real well.
Yeah. Okay, so we had some broccoli heads. Give some information while you were talking. Just talking about the leaves are as nutritious or more so than the heads, says Kathleen. And Cheryl also loves the leaves and the flowers and the sprouts. So people love their broccoli.
There's a lot to eat with broccoli. There's a lot of that plant is usable. So it's a nice crop to grow.
Good. And Janice is asking, what was the word you used for the summer sun shade cloth?
It's called row cover. It covers your row. That's what it is. It's a very thin fabric. You can see through it. Water goes through it. Very lightweight.
And Janice, I'm going to also comment, if you look at the top of the chat, I put a link to my plantlet. Anyway, when I did something with the Payson Community Garden, we had a whole presentation about row covers. And so they talked about all kinds of different ways that you can use them, different thicknesses and their appropriateness. And that brings me to a question here. Using your row cover, and I know they come in different thicknesses and so on, what is your opinion of plastic for a cover in the winter? Years ago, that's probably all we could get our hands on. now we've got, these other materials available. But does that create kind of a greenhouse effect? What do you think of using that as a cover?
So are you talking about putting it on and leaving it on?
Yeah, well, maybe not leaving it on, but a plastic cover to protect it from the cold. So you've got the cold months.
Yeah, one of the things to be careful with plastic in particular when you're using it as a cover, like a row cover or a frost cloth, is that wherever the plastic is touching the plants and you get frost that night, that part of the plant, that leaf, is probably going to freeze, or some people call it burn, and that leaf will be damaged. And the plastic, I understand, is more susceptible to doing that than row cover or frost cloth. I've actually never used the plastic, so I can't speak from experience, but everything that I've read tells me that.
Okay, so we've got better products now. All right, I'm not too sure how well we'll answer this, but Janine says, are the dates the same for everything you mentioned for Safford, which is a zone 8B? And I was just commenting that Rich is at a zone 8A. So very close, might start just a little bit earlier, right, Rich?
Yeah, that's what I would say. You're going to be in the ballpark there, especially if you're starting it early, like I'm giving you dates around September 1. Even if you use that date, you'd be fine. So yeah, we'd work out just fine. As I say, the winter planting is a lot more forgiving, there's a lot more wiggle room on the time for when you're doing stuff. Down in the valley, it's much tighter time frames.
Right, and we've got some more comments about timing and zones, and I don't think we're really well prepared to talk about that right now. Talk with your county extension agent, and just be logical. If it's a little bit warmer, you're going to have to start. You can start a little bit later. You don't want to start too late because you just know when it gets cold. And so those dates that he gave, I like those as well for Globe as well. And we're kind of a 9A to 8B here as well. So they made sense for this zone as well. Okay, Susan says she's encouraged, working in Vernon with the school kids. Thanks for the inspiration. Cynthia says, did not talk about growing, cauliflower very much. Do you grow it? And what's the difference with broccoli?
I don't grow cauliflower all that often. I do it occasionally, and it's fairly similar to the broccoli. I think it's a little bit slower, but it's very similar. So, if you pay attention to those planting dates, you'll end up with about the same thing.
So, yeah, just treat it the same way. And we're getting asked, how do you dry and store your onions?
Well, the drying part, you saw that rack that I had all those onions hanging from. That is the drying method. You want to be sure that that's not in the sunshine. Should be in shade, but still out in the heat. So even though it's really hot and you're harvesting it in the middle of the summertime, even in Tucson, it was the exact same procedure. You just hang it in the shade and you leave it there for a pretty fair amount of time. Like I'll probably leave it there for a couple of weeks and let it dry out pretty well, and then you can store it. Again, as I mentioned, the sweet onions don't store very well. They're very short shelf life, but the hotter ones do better. And the longer the day type onion, so short day, medium day, long day, the longer the day, the better they will store. And what you want to do storage wise is just be sure that they're not touching each other and they get good air circulation. Some people like to actually use a set of pantyhose. You can put one in, put one onion down in the bottom and then twist it, put another one in on top of that, twist it, put another one, so they're not touching each other, but they're all stacked up, and you hang that. I've never done that, but it's something that I've heard that some people do. So it's just a technique for that.
Very good. And got just a couple more questions here, and I'll go over to the Q&A. So I'm still in the chat box here, so just a second there. Got Byron mentioning that he's a snowbird. So he doesn't garden during the summer. He wants to know how to wake up the soil in October.
Well, if you were thinking ahead and planning ahead, at the end of the season, so if you're here for the winter, at the end of the season, feed your garden just as if you were putting it to bed for the winter. Give it some compost, give it whatever it needs, and hopefully and do some kind of a watering system for it to water it through the summer a bit. And it'll already be awakened by the time you're down here snowbirding to plant for the winter. Things will be in pretty good shape there because you fed it. It's like anything, you need to feed it and keep it going. That soil food web needs to be fed from time to time.
And when I think about that, mulch it thick, right, Rich? Because otherwise you're going to have weeds and other things, something's going to grow in it. So have a real thick layer of mulch, probably 5 or 6 inches.
Yep.
And have your soaker hose or those perforated hose that you're going to use for watering at the bottom of the mulch.
Right.
And if that can go on and off occasionally, I don't know if you got a neighbor to help out with that. I think that's going to be one thing if you turn off your water. Because if nobody's there to watch it and it breaks, well, that's not good at all. But yeah, but you're going to want to get, if you're able to get some water to it, or with the monsoon, that'd help. But somehow you got to be able to. But if it just dries out, it's going to. You just go ahead and start using it, right?
Yeah, you have to be aware that all those microbes that are doing all that great stuff for you, they live in water. They have to have water. So if you let your bed dry out entirely, it's going to kill most of that stuff. And so that you're going to have a tougher time getting it going.
Yeah.
So that's just a good little rule of thumb there. Okay.
And Izzy's asking about planting spinach and lettuce in the same bed. Why not?
Yeah, why not? Yeah, that works very well.
Yeah, the plants will grow together just fine. You may want to keep them apart. All right, so jumping over here to the Q&A. Can I plant? Oh, there it is. Just asked that. So Louise just bought a house with a backyard lawn, and she wants to make it to a vegetable garden. There's no grass in the lawn. It's totally weeds. How do I get rid of the weeds? I live in Phoenix. This is a whole nother talk, Louise.
Yeah. Weed removal is just, you're going to have to just dig them out, or you're going to have to dig anyway to get a bed established, unless you're going to do a raised bed or something. If you're going to do a raised bed and you want to go right on top of that, though, what you can do is just chop everything down, to ground level or near that, lay cardboard over the top, and then get your new bed going. Add the new soil that you're going to use and get all that stuff happening. And eventually what will happen is that cardboard will get eaten away, and then the soil below it will get incorporated into what you're doing, just because the microbes will, with it all being watered, will end up, enhancing all that stuff. It's not going to be the ideal thing down below, but at least what is happening in your raised bed will be good stuff.
And Louise, thanks for that question. I might get a speaker to talk about how to go from, not lawns, food, that kind of book that came out several years ago. But and the other problem that you're going to have is, if it has been watered, you don't see any grass, but once it gets water, the Bermuda will pop back up. But you just have to love gardening, and it's just going to be a bit of a project. So, and if I were me, I'd do raised gardens. I'd be doing the mulching like Rich mentioned in the walk paths, and just get that started again. Okay, so Cheryl's asking, if it's going to be getting cold enough for frost cloth for a few nights in a row, do you leave the cloth on, or do you take it off to reduce heat in the middle of the day? Also, any tips for putting frost cloth off and on without the damage?
Yeah, if you know you're going to have multiple days of cold weather, I put the frost cloth on and I leave it. It's a bunch of work to be taking it off and put it on. So the crops don't end up getting hurt much at all by it, and they're probably actually helped by it because they stay a little bit warmer. So that's what I do. To get it on and off, the hoops make that process a lot nicer, because if you're just kind of throwing it over the top, it's kind of a mess. The cloth gets all tangled up on itself, and it's just a pain in the neck getting it all anchored, because you have to anchor it down on the ends. And again, having the hoops gives you something really nice to anchor to, with clips, spring clips or something like that. It works pretty well. it is a bit of trouble. It's a bit of a hassle, but it's what you have to do.
And Payson Community Garden uses a lot of covers. So if you ever have a chance to go there, you'll get to see a lot of examples how people set up their hoops, but definitely excellent technique for keeping your plants alive. Like you said, just leave it on. It's so cold that it's going to actually help them. And even if you open them up, they're not going to do much because it's too cold.
Right.
All right. Okay. So Luis is asking, what are the best types of containers to use for a container garden? And do they need to have holes in the bottoms for drainage?
Well, you absolutely need holes in the bottom. Many kinds of containers can be used. The weather up here is the wintertime is not much of an issue for heat. In the summertime, especially in lower elevations, if the pot gets really hot, that's really bad for your roots. But you're not going to have that problem here. So probably most pots would work just fine. I've not done a lot of container gardening, so I'm not speaking from a lot of experience here. I've done some, but not a lot. I think just about anything would work here in the Payson area.
And Luis, in my playlist, if you go back to last summer, I had a couple of presentations on container gardening from my colleagues, Bill Cook and Jan Groth. And I think if you want to be putting vegetables in them, they should be fairly good sized containers, 10, 15, 20 gallon, so that they're big and large enough that you're able to just leave something in there for quite a while. I like using those containers for my parsley, chives, spices. And yeah, so containers are a good idea. A lot of people use them. Steve's asking, temperatures in northwestern Arizona are still running 95 to 112 degrees. What daytime temperature do you consider best for winter garden vegetables? It is still 90 to 100 degrees. So hearkening back to your Tucson days, and sounds like, I think Steve's out in Kingman, so it's probably even warmer. But what were you doing for your winter garden?
Yeah, you definitely want to wait until things have cooled off some. But remember, a lot of those pretty much, if you want an early harvest, the crops need to be started early and finished cold. Started warm and finished cold is the saying. So don't hesitate to plant when things are still on the hot side, as long as you know the cooler weather is coming. You don't want to have them in the ground for 2 or 3 months in the heat. But getting them started in the heat is a good thing, as long as the cooler weather is coming, and then you're going to have a good stretch of cool weather for your harvesting, for things to grow well. Those winter crops, they like the cold weather. They like it. They grow slowly when it gets real cold, but they like the cooler weather. That's what their claim to fame is.
And sometimes it just goes from hot to cold, it seems, So I wonder if Steve could use some type of shade cloth and moisture to be able to get his plants started. They'll come up, they'll tolerate some of the heat without getting that direct afternoon sun. And then they're already established for when it cools off in November.
Yeah, that sounds like a good approach. If you're too early with your lettuces and spinaches and things like that, they're going to bolt, and you're going to kind of screw up your whole winter crop right there, and you'll have to start over once that happens. So if you're too early, that's what will happen. So just be advised that could come along.
All right, good. Okay, another question is, do you cut down or cover your strawberries with straw or mulch to overwinter, or leave them to self-prune?
Yeah, I just kind of let them fend for themselves. So I don't cover them. I don't do any of that stuff. If I'm going to do any fertilizing, sometime in the late winter time frame, I'll get out there with some fertilizer when I know it's going to rain. So rain is imminent. I'll get out there and I'll spread it a little bit right on top of the stuff and let the rain wash it all in. But I don't do any frost protection whatsoever.
Okay, Rich, we've got several more questions. I hope you're able to stay with us.
Okay, sure.
I'm going to go ahead and shut down the webinar, though. I'll put up my closing slide, and we'll continue with your questions. Just hang on here, but we're at the top of the hour here. So our speaker has been Rich Johnson. Rich, thank you so much for sharing all of your knowledge about gardening with us. We had a great turnout, and we're still asking questions. We're in the middle of our Q&A. And so our next presentation will be on Thursday, September 2nd. We've got Ursula Schuch, who's our UA Extension Specialist on campus, a specialist of environmental horticulture. And she's going to be talking about drought and extreme heat, plant responses, and landscape maintenance practices. So this will go to your landscape plants, your trees and your shrubs rather than the vegetables. But Ursula does the research and she presents on it. So excellent person. If you haven't had a chance to listen to Ursula, she's another great presentation. We'll see you then. So thank you so much and have a good day, everybody.